There was a point early in my deployment aboard the USS Reagan where I thought I'd seen everything the Navy could throw at me. Long watches, brutal working conditions, sleep deprivation that would make a med student jealous. But none of that compared to dealing with a department head we'll call Lieutenant Commander Napoleon. This guy, man, where do I start? He was maybe 5'6" on a good day, fresh out of some staff college and convinced he was the reincarnation of Admiral Nimitz. He'd show up to the engineering spaces at 2 a.m. during our rest hours, wake everyone up, and demand we run drills. Not because there was an emergency, not because we had an inspection coming, but because, and I quote, real sailors don't need sleep. One night, we'd been working for 18 hours straight fixing a turbine. We finally got it done, cleaned up, and hit our racks. 2 hours later, here comes Napoleon, banging on the berthing hatches, screaming about how we're all lazy and worthless. He made us muster in full uniform, then made us do push-ups on the flight deck until 3 guys passed out from exhaustion. The thing was, we could handle the work. We could handle being tired. Hell, we signed up for this. But what we couldn't handle was a leader who treated us like we were less than human, who took pleasure in our suffering, who punished us not to maintain discipline, but because he enjoyed watching us break. After 6 months of this, half our department put in for transfer. The other half started having accidents that would get them medical leave. Nobody wanted to quit outright because we had pride in our work. But this one man, this one terrible leader, was destroying an entire department of skilled sailors. We never mutinied. We never had to. Eventually, enough complaints made it up the chain that Napoleon got quietly transferred to a desk job in Norfolk. But I often wondered, what would it take to push good men over that edge? How bad would a leader have to be before his own crew turned on him? Well, this is one of those stories, but this one happened during World War I. And this one, people died. This is the story of the USS Iowa and the mutiny that the Navy tried to bury for over a century. The mist which hangs before you offers you a choice, to pass through or to escape. Beyond it are stories which defy explanation and fly in the face of what we know to be real. It is a void of both reality and impossibility, of both fact and superstition. You alone are left to discern what to believe as you pass through what we call a fog of war. Keep your head down, Thompson. Colonel's on the prowl again. I heard he threw Seaman Martinez in the brig yesterday for having a loose button. Not just the brig, bread and water for 5 days for a button. Jesus Christ, this whole ship's going to hell, I'm telling you. It was March 1918. The First World War had been raging for nearly 4 years, and the United States had finally joined the fight. The seas were crawling with German U-boats, and every American warship was desperately needed in the Atlantic to protect supply convoys headed for Europe. But there was one ship that wouldn't be joining the war effort anytime soon. The USS Iowa, a pre-dreadnought battleship, was stuck on the West Coast undergoing what should have been routine training exercises. And the reason it was stuck? One man. His name was Colonel Carlton Beals, and he was about to become the most hated officer in United States naval history. Carlton Henry Beals was born in 1862 in rural Pennsylvania to a family with deep military roots. His father had served in the Civil War, and young Carlton grew up hearing stories of battlefield glory and military discipline. But here's the thing about Beals. He wasn't Navy. He was a Marine. Beals had joined the Marine Corps in 1881, and over the next 37 years he'd built a reputation as a hard-ass disciplinarian. He'd served in the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, and various other conflicts throughout the Caribbean. And everywhere he went, he left a trail of broken men and formal complaints. But Beals had something that kept him in the service despite his brutal methods, connections. His family knew senators. His uncle was a federal judge, and in the early 1900s that meant you could get away with damn near anything. By 1918, Beals was in his mid-50s and had reached the rank of colonel in the Marine Corps. He should have been behind a desk somewhere, planning operations. Instead, he'd been assigned as the commander of the Marine detachment aboard the USS Iowa, about 80 Marines whose job was to provide security and serve as a shipboard landing force. The problem? Colonel Beals didn't just want to command the Marines. He wanted to command everyone. The USS Iowa wasn't a glamorous assignment. Launched in 1896, she was already considered outdated by World War I standards. While newer dreadnoughts were being built with bigger guns and thicker armor, the Iowa was essentially being used as a training ship on the West Coast. But the crew didn't mind. They were professional sailors who took pride in their work. They maintained the ship, ran drills, and did their duty. The Iowa might have been old, but her crew kept her running like clockwork. That all changed when Colonel Beals came aboard in January 1918. Within his first week, Beals had started inserting himself into every aspect of ship operations, far beyond his jurisdiction as Marine commander. He would inspect the sailors' berthing areas and write up violations. He would watch the deck crew at work and demand they be punished for perceived laziness. He even tried to take over the ship's training schedule. The ship's actual commanding officer, Captain Robert Kuntz, was a seasoned naval officer who tried to maintain peace. He pulled Beals aside multiple times and reminded him that his authority extended only to the Marine detachment, not the entire ship. Beals didn't care. "Captain Kuntz," he reportedly said during one heated exchange, "these men are soft. They need to be hardened. If you won't do it, I will." And harden them he did. Beals' preferred method of discipline was something called summary court-martial. Basically, for minor infractions, he could convene a quick trial and hand out punishments without much oversight. And Beals loved using it. Within 2 months, Beals had court-martialed over 120 men, both Marines and sailors. That's more than 10% of the entire ship's complement. The offenses? Laughable. One sailor got 5 days in the brig for not saluting fast enough. Another got 10 days for having scuffed shoes. A Marine was given bread and water for a week because Beals didn't like the way he stood at attention. But the punishments themselves were even worse than the fake charges. Beals would order men shackled in the ship's brig with no ventilation in the California heat. He would deny them water. He would have them beaten by his loyalist Marines if they complained. One sailor, a kid named Jimmy Delaney who was only 19 years old, was strung up by his wrists for 6 hours because he'd been caught smoking in an unauthorized area. The ship's doctor, Lieutenant Commander Hayes, tried to intervene multiple times. He wrote reports detailing the inhumane conditions in the brig. He documented injuries consistent with beatings. He even went directly to Captain Kuntz and demanded something be done. But Kuntz was in an impossible position. Beals technically had the authority to discipline his Marines however he saw fit. And while Beals was overstepping with the sailors, he was careful to always claim he had permission or was acting on the captain's orders, which he wasn't. More importantly, Beals had friends in high places. He'd already survived multiple investigations into his conduct during his earlier postings. Every time, his political connections had saved him. Kuntz knew that if he moved against Beals without ironclad evidence, it would be his own career on the line. So he did what a lot of weak leaders do. Nothing. By March 1918, the USS Iowa was a powder keg waiting to explode. The crew had split into factions. There were those who feared Beals and kept their heads down. There were those who actively brown-nosed him, hoping for preferential treatment. And then there was a growing group of men who had simply had enough. They started meeting in secret, in the engineering spaces late at night, in storage compartments during off hours. They passed notes. They whispered in the chow line. One name kept coming up as a natural leader, gunner's mate First Class Patrick O'Sullivan. O'Sullivan was a 15-year Navy veteran. He was respected, calm under pressure, and had a reputation for standing up for his men. He'd been written up by Beals 3 times, once for insolence, when he'd asked why one of his gunners was being punished, once for having a slovenly appearance despite being in perfect uniform, and once for spreading discontent, when he'd simply told his men they had rights under Navy regulations. The third write-up had earned O'Sullivan 10 days in the brig on bread and water. When he got out, he was a changed man. It was March 8, 1918. The Iowa was anchored off San Pedro, California. Most of the officers were ashore for a formal dinner with local dignitaries. Only a skeleton crew of officers remained aboard, including Colonel Beals, who never left the ship because he didn't trust the crew not to slack off in his absence. Around 2100 hours, about 40 men gathered in one of the lower deck compartments. O'Sullivan was there. So was a boatswain's mate named Eddie Cruz, a Marine corporal named James Woodward, and dozens of others. They passed around a bottle of whiskey, contraband that someone had smuggled aboard. And they talked. "We can't keep living like this," O'Sullivan said. "That bastard is going to get someone killed." "So what do we do?" Cruz asked. "We can't exactly vote him off the island." "No," O'Sullivan replied, "but we can remove him from command." The room went quiet. "You talking about mutiny?" Woodward asked. O'Sullivan nodded slowly. "I'm talking about saving this ship and this crew. Beals isn't fit to lead. He's a tyrant. And if we don't stop him, more men are going to suffer." The debate that followed lasted for hours. These weren't cowards or troublemakers. They were professional military men who understood the severity of what they were discussing. Mutiny was a capital offense. They could hang for this. But they also understood that sometimes following orders means betraying everything you swore to protect. Finally, around midnight, they took a vote. It was unanimous. The plan was simple. Wait until Colonel Beals made his nightly inspection rounds, overpower him, confine him to his quarters, and then present their grievances to Captain Kuntz in the morning with Beals unable to retaliate. It wasn't a violent overthrow. It wasn't a pirate-style rebellion. It was, in their minds, the only way to protect themselves and force the Navy to actually investigate what was happening aboard the Iowa. At 0200 hours on March 9th, Colonel Beals left his cabin to make his rounds. He did this every night, prowling the ship looking for men sleeping on watch or any other violation he could punish. He made it about 20 feet before a group of men stepped out from behind a bulkhead. O'Sullivan was in front. "Colonel Beals, we need to talk." Beals' hand immediately went to the sidearm he always carried. "Get out of my way, sailor. That's an order." "No, sir," O'Sullivan said calmly. "We're done taking orders from you." What happened next is disputed. Some accounts say Beals drew his weapon first. Others say O'Sullivan moved to restrain him and Beals panicked. Either way, in the scuffle that followed, Beals' pistol went off. The bullet hit Marine Corporal James Woodward in the chest. He died instantly. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the ship like a cannon blast. Men came running from all directions. The mutineers panicked. This wasn't supposed to happen. Nobody was supposed to die. In the chaos, Colonel Beals broke free and started running toward the officers' quarters, screaming for help. He didn't make it. 3 sailors tackled him from behind. In the struggle, Beals hit his head on a steel hatchway. Hard. He fell to the deck, blood pouring from a gash on his temple. And he didn't get up. The mutiny was over almost as soon as it began. When the officers returned to the ship the next morning, they found Colonel Carlton Beals in the ship's medical bay, unconscious with a severe skull fracture. They found Marine Corporal James Woodward in the morgue, and they found 40 men confined to the brig, including Patrick O'Sullivan, waiting to be charged with mutiny and murder. What followed was one of the most politically sensitive court-martials in U.S. Navy history. The Navy didn't want this story getting out. They were in the middle of a war. The last thing they needed was headlines about American sailors mutinying against their officers. It would be a propaganda victory for Germany and a disaster for morale, so they buried it. The court-martial was held in secret. No press was allowed. The transcripts were immediately classified, and the verdicts were handed down with shocking speed. Patrick O'Sullivan and 5 other ringleaders were convicted of mutiny and sentenced to death by hanging. But here's where it gets interesting. Captain Robert Kuntz, who had done nothing to stop Beals' reign of terror, suddenly grew a conscience. He wrote a lengthy report detailing every abuse Beals had committed. He included testimony from dozens of crew members. He even included the medical reports from Dr. Hayes showing evidence of torture, and he sent it directly to the Secretary of the Navy. The report caused a firestorm in Washington. Congressional representatives started asking questions. Families of the convicted men hired lawyers, and someone leaked the story to the press. Within weeks, it was front-page news across the country. Navy sailors pushed to mutiny by brutal officer. The public was outraged, not at the mutineers, but at the Navy for allowing someone like Beals to remain in command. Facing enormous political pressure, President Woodrow Wilson personally intervened. He commuted all 6 death sentences to life imprisonment. 3 years later, he pardoned them entirely. As for Colonel Carlton Beals, he survived his head injury, but he never fully recovered. He was medically retired from the Marine Corps with full honors, because to court-martial him would have required admitting that the Navy had allowed a tyrant to terrorize his own men. He died in 1924, bitter and unrepentant. The USS Iowa would go on to serve honorably through World War I and beyond. But the crew never forgot what happened in March 1918. They never forgot that their own leadership had failed them. And they never forgot the price that Corporal James Woodward paid for one man's cruelty. So remember that lieutenant commander I mentioned at the beginning? Napoleon? After he got transferred, we got a new department head. Guy's name was Lieutenant Commander Ramirez. Total opposite personality. First thing he did when he came aboard was call a department meeting. He sat us all down and said, "Look, I know things have been rough. I read the reports. I know you've been through hell. But I need you to know something. My job isn't to make your lives miserable. My job is to make sure you can do your job safely and effectively. So here's the deal. You keep this ship running, and I'll keep the brass off your backs. Fair?" And you know what? That's all it took. One leader who actually gave a damn about his people. Within a month, our department's morale completely turned around. Guys stopped putting in for transfer. Work got done faster and better. We actually started volunteering for extra duties because we wanted to help Commander Ramirez succeed. That's the thing about leadership in the military or anywhere, really. You can rule through fear for a while. You can abuse your authority. You can make people's lives hell. But eventually, people break. And when they do, it's never pretty. The story of the USS Iowa is a reminder that rank doesn't make you a leader. A title doesn't earn you respect. What makes a leader is how you treat the people under your command when nobody's watching. Colonel Beals had all the authority in the world. He had the rank, the experience, the connections, but he didn't have the one thing that actually matters, the respect of his men. And in the end, that cost him everything. Patrick O'Sullivan and the other mutineers weren't heroes. They killed a man, and they paid for it. But they also weren't villains. They were good men pushed past their breaking point by a leader who had no business being in command. The Navy learned a hard lesson that day. Your people will only follow you as far as you're willing to lead them. And if you lead them into darkness, don't be surprised when they stop following. As for me, I think about Commander Ramirez sometimes. How easy it would have been for him to be just another petty tyrant. How he chose instead to actually give a damn. And I think about all the Colonel Beals out there, the bad leaders who make good people's lives miserable, who abuse their authority, who think that fear equals respect. To those leaders, I'll say this: your people remember. They always remember. And someday, somewhere, you'll be held accountable. Held, maybe not by a court-martial, maybe not by a mutiny, but by history, by the people whose lives you damaged, by the men and women who will tell their kids and grandkids about the tyrant they served under. Thank you for watching, for subscribing, for all the support. Stay safe out there. And if you ever find yourself serving under a Colonel Beals, well, keep your head down and document everything. I'll see you in the next one.